The rope scratched against Marlowe's throat as Sheriff Caspian Knox's hands worked frantically at the knot above her head. The mob below screamed for blood, their torches casting dancing shadows across the old oak tree that had claimed too many. "Innocent lives in Copper Ridge. Cut her down, Knox," Mayor Hutchins bellowed from horseback. "She killed Jeremiah Wolfe in cold blood." Caspian's jaw tightened as he sliced through the hemp with his hunting knife. Marlowe's body crumpled in two, his arms unconscious but breathing. He'd seen the bruises on her wrists, the torn fabric of her dress, the terror in her green eyes before they dragged her here. No woman fought that hard unless she was defending herself. "This woman gets a fair trial," he announced, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. His badge caught the firelight as he shifted Marlowe's weight against his chest. "Anyone who disagrees can take it up with my Colt." The crowd hesitated. Caspian Knox had earned his reputation with that gun, and even bloodthirsty farmers knew better than to test him as he carried Marlowe toward the jailhouse. Her eyes fluttered open. She stared up at him with a mixture of confusion and wariness that made his chest tighten. Most women in Copper Ridge looked at him with admiration or fear, but this one studied him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the rope. "Because hanging innocent women isn't justice," he replied, kicking open the door to his office. "You don't know I'm innocent." Caspian laid her gently on the cot in the single cell, noting how she flinched when his shadow fell across her. "Tell me what happened." Marlowe's laugh held no humor. "Would it matter? I'm property now. Remember? Sold fair and square to the highest bidder. The marriage auction." Caspian's hands clenched into fists. He'd been hunting outlaws in the mountains. When the town council decided to auction off the surplus women, widows, and spinsters who couldn't support themselves, by the time he'd returned, 12 women had been sold like cattle to men with coin and cruel intentions. "Jeremiah Wolfe bought you for $50 and a bottle of whiskey." Marlowe sat up slowly, her auburn hair falling around her shoulders like spilled copper. He thought ownership meant I'd submit to whatever he wanted. I proved him wrong. Caspian studied the defiant tilt of her chin, the way she held herself despite the bruises and exhaustion. Most women would be sobbing, begging for mercy. Marlowe looked ready to fight the devil himself. "Where's the body?" "His cabin, I suppose. I left through the window after. ... She shuddered. "After I stuck his own knife between his ribs. Self-defense. Try convincing 12 men of that when I was legally his wife." Marlowe's green eyes blazed. "In their minds, I'm a murderer and a thief. Property that destroyed its owner." Caspian unlocked the cell door, ignoring her surprised gasp. "Then we'll have to change their minds." Dawn broke cold and gray over Copper Ridge as Caspian saddled his horse outside the jailhouse. Marlowe stood in the doorway, wrapped in his spare coat, watching him with those calculating green eyes that had haunted his sleep. "You're really taking me to see the body?" she asked. "Evidence speaks louder than accusations." He mounted his gelding and extended his hand. "Can you ride?" Marlowe hesitated before accepting his help up behind him. Her arms wrapped around his waist for balance, and Caspian tried to ignore how right it felt to have her close. He'd sworn off women after his last heartbreak, but Marlowe affected him in ways that made his badge feel heavier. The ride to Wolfe's cabin took an hour through mountain trails thick with pine. Marlowe's grip tightened whenever they passed a steep drop, and Caspian found himself slowing the horse to ease her fear. "You're not what I expected," she said against his shoulder. "What did you expect? Another man who sees women as problems to be solved or possessions to be managed?" Her breath warmed his neck. "Sheriff Knox, the town's golden boy who keeps the peace and asks no difficult questions. You know my reputation." "Oh, I know the stories." "War hero turned lawman, faster with a gun than anyone in 3 counties, too honorable for his own good." Marlowe's voice carried a note of sadness. "What I don't understand is why you're risking it for someone like me." Before Caspian could answer, they crested the ridge overlooking Wolfe's property. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by dying sunflowers, its door hanging open like a mouth frozen in a scream. Inside, Jeremiah Wolfe lay sprawled across the kitchen table, his shirt dark with dried blood. A bone-handled knife protruded from his chest at an upward angle. Caspian studied the scene with a lawman's eye. noting the overturned chairs, the broken crockery, the deep scratches in the wooden floor. "He cornered you in here," Caspian said. Following the evidence, Marlowe nodded, her face pale. "I tried to reason with him first, told him I needed time, that we barely knew each other. He laughed and said he'd paid for immediate delivery of his goods." Caspian's jaw tightened as he examined the knife wound. "You're shorter than Wolf by a foot. The angle's all wrong for a frontal attack." He grabbed me from behind. Hellos. Voice grew smaller. Started tearing at my dress. I managed to get the knife from the table, and ... double quotes, she shuddered. Just wanted him to stop. The door creaked behind them. Caspian spun, his hand moving to his gun, as 3 men entered the cabin. Deputy Marshal Brock Hadley led them, his star catching the morning light. Behind him came Dr. Quincy Morris and Judge Aldrich Fane. Well, Hadley drawled, his eyes moving from Marlowe to the body. "Bringing the murderess back to admire her handiwork, Knox?" Investigating the facts, Caspian replied evenly. "Something you might try before forming opinions?" Judge Fane stepped forward, his black robes rustling. "The facts are simple, Sheriff. This woman was legally wed to Jeremiah Wolf. She killed her husband. Under territorial law, that's murder, regardless of the circumstances. Under any decent law, it's self-defense." "Decent?" Hadley laughed harshly. "Shh. Auction goods. Knox? Damaged goods at that. We hang her today and put this ugliness behind us."
Caspian's hand rested on his gun butt.
"Over my dead body." Duh! Tension in the room stretched taut as a bowstring. Marlowe stepped closer to Caspian, and he felt her trembling despite her brave facade. "There's another way," Judge Fane said slowly. "The territorial governor is visiting next week. You could hold her until then. Let him decide." It wasn't much, but it was time. Caspian nodded reluctantly. 1 week, as they prepared to leave, Marlowe touched his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. "But—" Caspian saw the doubt in her eyes, the resignation of someone who'd learned not to hope too hard. He had 7 days to prove that justice still meant something in Copper Ridge, 7 days to save the woman who was stealing his heart. The Copper Ridge jail had never held a woman before Marlowe, and Caspian found himself making small changes. To accommodate her presence, he brought her books from his personal collection, ensured she had privacy for washing, and ignored the disapproving stares from townspeople who thought he was being too soft. On the 3rd day, Mayor Hutchins stormed into the office with fire in his eyes. "This has gone far enough, Knox," he declared, slamming his fist on Caspian's desk. "Half the town thinks you've lost your mind over some murderous woman, and the other half is questioning whether we need a sheriff who won't uphold the law." Caspian looked up from the law books he'd been studying. Which law would that be? The one that says a man can buy a wife like livestock? Or the one that says she has no right to defend herself when he tries to rape her? Those auctions were legal and necessary. They had too many unmarried women becoming burdens on the community, so you sold them. Caspian's voice was dangerously quiet, like cattle at market. From the cell, Marlowe listened to every word. She'd been watching Caspian for 3 days, seeing how he treated everyone from drunk cowboys to frightened children with the same steady patience. He was nothing like the men she'd known, men who took what they wanted and justified it with law, custom, or simple strength. "The governor arrives in 4 days, Hutchins continued. "When he sees what kind of chaos you've allowed, your badge won't protect you." After the mayor left, Caspian brought Marlowe her evening meal. She noticed he'd been eating less, spending his money on better food for her while making do with hardtack and coffee for himself. "You can't keep this up forever," she said softly. "Don't plan to." Caspian sat in the chair beside her cell. "I've been writing letters, sending telegrams. There are people in the territorial capital who believe in justice over convenience. And if they don't help..." Caspian's gray eyes met hers through the bars. "Then we'll find another way." That night, Marlowe lay awake listening to Caspian's breathing. From his cot across the room, she'd tried not to care about him, knowing that caring led to disappointment and pain. But every day he fought for her, every kindness he showed despite the cost to himself, wore down her defenses. She was falling in love with her protector, and it terrified her more than the noose. The 4th day brought unexpected visitors. a woman. In an expensive traveling dress, swept into the jail accompanied by two serious men in suits. Caspian rose from his desk, clearly surprised. "Mrs. Victoria Ashworth," the woman announced. "I represent the Women's Legal Defense Society of Denver. We received your telegram, Sheriff Knox." Hope fluttered in Marlowe's chest. She'd heard whispers of such organizations, wealthy women from back east, who fought for legal reforms. "This is highly irregular," Deputy Marshal Hadley protested, appearing in the doorway. "So is auctioning." "Women like property," Mrs. Ashworth replied coolly. "Now we've brought a lawyer and a federal marshal. Miss Marlowe will receive proper legal representation." The lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Cornelius Blackthorne, spent hours interviewing Marlowe and examining the evidence. His questions were thorough but respectful, nothing like the hostile interrogation she'd expected. "Your case isn't just about self-defense," he explained. "It's about whether territorial law can supersede basic human rights. If we win, it could end these marriage auctions forever. And if we lose," Blackthorne's expression grew grave, "then we pray the federal marshal can find grounds for clemency." That evening, as preparations continued for the governor's arrival, Caspian finally spoke the words that had been building in his heart. "When this is over," he said quietly, "if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly. Not as sheriff too, prisoner, but as man to woman." Marlowe's breath caught. "Caspian, I know it's not the time or place, but I needed you to know. Whatever happens tomorrow, you've changed me. Made me remember why I pinned on this badge in the first place." Marlowe reached through the bars to touch his hand. "I've never had anyone fight for me before. Not like this." "Then you've never known the right men." Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and Marlowe wondered if they were an omen of the battle to come. Governor Nathaniel Cromwell arrived, in Copper Ridge with all the pomp befitting a territorial leader, his carriage flanked by armed guards and trailing a cloud of dust that settled over the nervous town like a shroud. Caspian watched from the jailhouse window as crowds gathered in the street, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Quite a show, Marlowe observed from her cell, though her voice carried more worry than wonder. "Cromwell's a politician first, a judge second," Caspian replied. "He'll want to make a decision that serves his career." Says Ashworth and her legal team had worked through the night, preparing arguments and gathering sworn statements from other auction victims who'd found the courage to speak. Dr. Morse had provided a detailed medical examination of Marlowe's injuries, documenting evidence of Wolf's assault. The hearing convened in the town hall at noon, with Governor Cromwell presiding from behind the mayor's desk, like a king holding court. The building packed with spectators, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of tension that made Caspian's hand rest unconsciously on his gun. Marlowe sat between Lawyer Blackthorne and Mrs. Ashworth, her chin raised despite the hostile stares from many in the crowd. She wore a simple blue dress Mrs. Ashworth had brought, but to Caspian she looked more dignified than any fine lady he'd ever seen. "This hearing will determine whether Miss Marlowe Sinclair acted in lawful self-defense or committed murder, Governor," Cromwell announced. "Given the unusual circumstances, I've agreed to hear arguments from both sides before rendering judgment." Deputy Marshal Hadley presented the prosecution's case with theatrical flair, painting Marlowe as a ungrateful woman who'd murdered her lawful husband in cold blood. He called Mayor Hutchins to testify about the necessity of the marriage auctions. And several townsmen who spoke of Wolf's good character. Jeremiah Wolf was a respected member of this community, Hadley declared. He paid good money for a wife, expecting companionship and obedience as guaranteed by law. Instead, he received a knife in the chest. When Blackthorne rose to present the defense, the room's atmosphere shifted. He spoke quietly, but powerfully about human dignity, about the difference between legal and moral, about a woman's right to defend herself against assault regardless of her marital status. "Members of this hearing," he said, "we are not here to judge whether territorial law permits the sale of women. We are here to determine whether that same law permits their murder through legalized rape and abuse." The word rape sent a shocked murmur through the crowd. Several women in the back began whispering urgently to their husbands. Dr. Morse took the stand to describe Marlowe's injuries in clinical detail that left no doubt about Wolf's intentions. Mrs. Ashworth testified about similar cases across the territory, presenting evidence of a pattern of abuse that the marriage auctions had enabled. Finally, Marlowe herself stood to testify. "I didn't want to kill anyone," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "I begged him to stop, to give me time, to treat me like a human being instead of property he'd purchased. When he wouldn't listen to words, I defended myself the only way I could." "You were his lawful wife," Hadley interjected. "You had no right to refuse him." Marlowe's green eyes blazed. "I had the right to refuse anyone who sought to harm me. That right doesn't disappear because $50 changed hands." Governor Cromwell studied the evidence and testimony for what felt like hours. While the crowd waited in tense silence, Caspian watched Marlowe's face, seeing the fear she tried to hide behind her brave facade. Finally, Cromwell spoke. "This case presents a conflict between territorial statute and fundamental justice. While the marriage auction was technically legal, it created circumstances that led directly to the violence in question." He paused, his eyes moving around the packed room. "However, I cannot ignore that a man is dead by this woman's hand." Caspian's heart sank as he saw where this was heading. "Therefore, I find Miss Sinclair guilty of manslaughter, not murder. She will serve 2 years in the territorial prison, with possibility of early release for good behavior." The crowd erupted. In mixed reactions, some cheering the conviction, others protesting the light sentence. But Caspian heard only the sound of his world crashing down. 2 years might as well be forever in a place like territorial prison. As the guards moved forward to take Marlowe into custody, she turned to look at him one last time. Her eyes held no accusation, only a sad understanding that they had fought the good fight and lost. "I'm sorry," Cromwell said quietly to Mrs. Ashworth as the crowd dispersed. "It was the best I could do without starting a revolution." Caspian. Knox was already planning his own revolution, one that would ensure Marlowe. Sinclair never saw the inside of a territorial prison. The territorial prison wagon was scheduled to depart at dawn. But Caspian had no intention of letting it leave Copper Ridge with Marlowe aboard. He spent the night after the hearing making careful preparations, knowing he was about to cross a line that would change his life forever. At 3 a.m., he quietly saddled 2 horses and loaded supplies into his saddlebags. His badge felt heavy on his chest as he pinned it one last time, knowing he'd likely never wear it again after tonight. The guards holding Marlowe in the temporary holding cell at the town hall were local Menonists, but not particularly bright. Caspian approached the building as Sheriff Knox, counting on their respect for his authority. "Governor wants the prisoner transferred early," he told them, showing official-looking papers he'd forged by lamplight. "Seems there's been threats against her life. We're moving her out before the troublemakers wake up." The guards, sleepy and eager to avoid responsibility, didn't question him too closely. Within minutes, Marlowe was walking beside him through the pre-dawn darkness, her wrists shackled more for show than security. "What are you doing?" she whispered as they reached the horses. "What I should have done from the beginning." Caspian unlocked her shackles and helped her mount. "Getting you somewhere safe?" "Caspian, you can't. Your career, your reputation don't mean a damn thing if I let an innocent woman rot in prison." He swung up onto his gelding and looked back at the sleeping town. "Besides, I've been thinking about a change of scenery." They rode hard through the mountain passes, putting distance between themselves and Copper Ridge before anyone discovered the deception. Marlowe proved an excellent rider despite her ordeal, keeping pace without complaint as they climbed toward the high country. By afternoon, they'd reached an abandoned mining camp called Silver Creek, its empty buildings scattered across a valley like broken teeth. Caspian had discovered the place during a manhunt months earlier, noting its isolation and defensible position. "We can rest here," he said, helping Marlowe down from her horse. "Water's good and there's shelter in the old assay office." As they settled into the dusty building, Marlowe finally asked the question he'd been dreading. "Where do we go from here? You've thrown away everything for me, but we can't run forever." Caspian built a small fire against the evening chill. I've got friends in California who don't ask too many questions. We could start over there, build something new." "Fugitives," as free people. He turned to face her fully. Marlowe, I know this isn't the life you planned. But she silenced him with a kiss that tasted of desperation and hope, and something deeper that made his heart race. When they broke apart, her green eyes were bright with unshed tears. You fool, she whispered. Beautiful, noble fool. Do you know what you've done? Saved the woman I love? Destroyed yourself for someone who isn't worth it. Caspian cupped her face in his hands. Let me be the judge of what you're worth. They made love that night by firelight. It's desperate and tender and completely right, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Afterward, as Marlowe slept in his arms, Caspian stared at the stars through the broken roof and wondered if love was always supposed to feel like falling off a cliff. Dawn brought the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. Caspian was on his feet. Instantly, gun in hand, as riders approached the camp. Through the window, he counted 6 men led by Deputy Marshal Hadley, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Knox, Hadley called out. We know you're in there. Come out with your hands up and the woman with you. Marlowe pressed close to his side, fully dressed and ready to run. The back window, she suggested. Caspian shook his head. They'll have. It covered Hadley's not stupid. Then what? He checked his ammunition and smiled grimly. Then we remind them why they used to call me the fastest gun in 3 counties. But as he prepared to make his stand, a new voice called out from the approaching riders, one that made both of them freeze in surprise. Sheriff Knox. This is Federal Marshal Douglas Crane. I have a federal warrant that supersedes territorial authority. Stand down. Caspian peered through the window and saw a man in a dark suit riding beside Hadley, his federal badge clearly visible. Behind them came Mrs. Ashworth and Lawyer Blackthorne, their faces grave but determined. What the hell? Marlowe breathed. The federal marshal's voice carried clearly across the valley. Miss Sinclair, you are hereby granted federal protection. Pending review of your case, Governor Cromwell's judgment has been overturned by Federal Circuit Court. Hope and disbelief warred in Marlowe's chest as she looked at Caspian. Is this real? Only one way to find out? What? He holstered his gun and opened the door. Federal Marshal Douglas Crane is a serious man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to dangerous situations, his hand resting casually on his gun, but as he approached the abandoned assay office, Sheriff Knox, he said with a slight nod, you've caused quite a stir, Deputy. Marshal Hadley's face was red with frustration. This man is a criminal. He helped a convicted murderer escape federal custody. Actually, Mrs. Ashworth interjected, stepping forward with a leather satchel full of documents. Miss Sinclair was never in federal custody. Governor Cromwell exceeded his authority by conducting that hearing without proper federal oversight. Lawyer Blackthorne joined her, his usual composed demeanor brightened by obvious satisfaction. The territorial marriage auction law has been declared unconstitutional by the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals. All contracts and judgments stemming from those auctions are hereby void. Marlowe stepped out of the building beside Caspian, squinting, in the bright morning sunlight. What does that mean exactly? It means, Marshal Crane said carefully, that your marriage to Jeremiah Wolfe was never legally valid. Which means you couldn't have murdered your husband, since he wasn't your husband. She still killed a man, Hadley protested. In self-defense against attempted rape, Blackthorne replied smoothly, which is justifiable homicide under both territorial and federal law. Caspian felt years of tension leaving his shoulders. So, she's free. She's free, Marshal Crane confirmed. Though I'm afraid your situation is more complicated, Sheriff. Technically, you did aid in the escape of someone under territorial custody, regardless of whether that custody was legal. The words hit Caspian like a physical blow. He'd known this moment would come, but facing the end of his career still felt like losing a piece of himself. However, Marshal Crane continued, given the extraordinary circumstances and the fact that territorial authorities acted outside their jurisdiction, I'm prepared to recommend federal charges be dropped in exchange for your resignation from men. Territorial law enforcement. That's all. Marlowe asked, her voice tight with worry. That's all, the marshal confirmed. Sheriff Knox acted according to his conscience in defense of justice. The federal government doesn't punish men for having principles. Deputy Marshal Hadley looked like he'd swallowed something bitter. This is outrageous. Knox broke the law, Hadley, Marshal Crane said quietly. I suggest you worry more about explaining to your superiors why you participated in an illegal marriage auction and less about Sheriff Knox's actions. The color drained from Hadley's face as the implications sank. Mrs. Ashworth smiled with predatory satisfaction. The Women's Legal Defense Society has documented extensive evidence of abuse connected to these auctions, she said. We'll be seeking federal prosecution of everyone involved in organizing them. As the group prepared to return to Copper Ridge, Caspian found himself walking beside Marshal Crane while Marlowe rode with Mrs. Ashworth. The two women deep in conversation about the legal precedent the case had set. What will you do now? Crane asked. Caspian looked ahead at Marlowe, her auburn hair catching the sunlight as she laughed at something Mrs. Ashworth had said. Haven't thought that far ahead. I might have a suggestion. The Federal Marshal's Service is expanding, and we need men with integrity and experience. The pay's better than territorial sheriff, and you'd answer to Washington instead of local politicians. Federal Marshal.
Think about it.
A man who'd risk his career to save an innocent woman is exactly the kind of lawman we need. That evening, as they made camp in a meadow halfway back to town, Caspian and Marlowe sat by the fire watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The danger was over, the legal battles won, but uncertainty about their future remained. Mrs. Ashworth offered me a position with the Legal Defense Society, Marlowe said quietly. Helping other women in situations like mine, that's important work. It would mean traveling, speaking publicly about what happened. Not exactly the quiet life most men want from a wife. Caspian turned to study her profile in the firelight. Is that what you think I want? A quiet, submissive wife who stays home and asks no questions. Isn't it what most men want? I'm not most men. He took her hand, marveling at the calluses that spoke of hard work and harder survival. Marlowe, I fell in love with your strength. Your courage, your refusal to be broken by circumstances that would have destroyed someone weaker. Why would I want you to become less than you are? She looked at him with wonder, as if he'd revealed some impossible truth. You really mean that? Really do. Besides, he added with a smile, Marshal Crane offered me a position with the Federal Service. Seems like we'd both be in the business of fighting injustice. A federal marshal and a legal advocate, Marlowe mused. People would talk. Let them talk. We'll be too busy making the world a little more just to listen. As they kissed under the stars, both of them finally understood that love wasn't about possession or control, but about two strong people choosing to build something together that neither could create alone. 6 months later, the podium in the Denver Federal Courthouse, addressing a packed gallery of reporters, lawmakers, and women who'd traveled hundreds of miles to hear her speak. Her green eyes were calm and confident as she detailed the legal precedent their case had established. The Sinclair decision has invalidated marriage auctions in 4 territories, she announced to enthusiastic applause. But our work is far from finished. As long as women are treated as property under any law, we must continue fighting. In the back of the room, Federal Marshal Caspian Knox watched his wife with fierce pride. The gold badge on his chest caught the afternoon light streaming through tall windows, and he absently adjusted the wedding ring that still felt wonderfully unfamiliar on his finger. Their wedding had been a simple affair in Mrs. Ashworth's Denver parlor, witnessed by fellow marshals and legal advocates who'd become their chosen family. Judge Blackthorne had performed the ceremony, joking that it was the most satisfying legal proceeding he'd ever presided over. After Marlowe's speech, they walked together through the busy streets of Denver, a city that represented everything. Copper Ridge was not progressive, diverse, and filled with opportunities for people willing to work for change. How was the Morrison case? Marlowe asked, linking her arm through his. Resolved peacefully, thankfully. The railroad backed down once they realized we had federal jurisdiction. Caspian squeezed her hand. 3 families get to keep their land, and the company has to find another route for their tracks. Justice served. Justice served, he agreed. They'd found their rhythm over the past months, their careers complementing each other in unexpected ways. Caspian's federal cases often involved situations where local law had failed the powerless. Marlowe's advocacy work created the legal framework to prevent such failures in the future. At home, in their modest house near the courthouse, they settled into the comfortable domestic routine they'd built together. Marlowe reviewed legal briefs, while Caspian cleaned his guns and wrote reports. Both of them content in the quiet companionship they'd never expected to find. "I received a letter from Copper Ridge today," Marlowe said, looking up from her papers, Caspian's, hands stilled on his Colt. They rarely spoke of their former home, though news occasionally reached them through official channels. "Mayor Hutchins was arrested last week," she continued. "Federal charges related to the marriage auctions. Apparently, he'd been taking kickbacks from some of the buyers, and Hadley is transferred to a territorial post in Montana, far from anywhere he can cause trouble." Caspian nodded, feeling no satisfaction in their former enemy's downfall. Justice was about protecting the innocent, not punishing the guilty, though sometimes the two coincided. "Do you ever miss it?" Marlowe asked. "The simplicity of small-town life. I miss the mountains," he admitted. "The quiet mornings, the way everyone knew everyone else. But I don't miss the ignorance, the casual cruelty. The way people accepted injustice as long as it didn't affect them personally. We could visit sometime, show them how things turned out." Caspian considered this, imagining walking down Copper Ridge's main street with Marlowe on his arm, both of them successful and respected in their own right. The idea held a certain appeal. "Maybe we will," he said. "When you're ready." Later that night, as they lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the city outside their window, Marlowe curled against Caspian's side with a contentment she'd never thought possible. "I've been thinking," she said softly, "about children, family." She felt him tense slightly and hurried to continue. "Not now, but someday, when we're ready." Caspian was quiet for so long, she wondered if she'd made a mistake bringing it up. Finally he spoke. "I'd like that. Little girl with your courage and stubborn streak. Or a boy with your sense of justice and terrible aim with a lasso." "My aim with a lasso is perfectly adequate," he protested, making her laugh. "Whatever you say, Marshal Knox." As she drifted off to sleep, Marlowe reflected on the strange path that had brought them together. A marriage auction designed to reduce women to property had instead revealed the kind of man willing to sacrifice everything for principle. A false accusation of murder had led to the legal precedent that would protect countless other women. Sometimes the worst circumstances led to the best outcomes, if you were brave enough to fight for them. Caspian lay awake a while longer, one hand resting protectively on Marlowe's shoulder. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new injustices to fight, new opportunities to make the world a little more fair. It was hard work, often dangerous and frequently thankless, but it was their work, chosen freely and pursued together. In the end, that made all the difference. Outside their window, Denver slept peacefully under a canopy of stars. And two people who'd found love in the shadow of a hanging tree dreamed of the future they were building together. One case, one precedent, one small victory at a time.